we are looking for passages in the Gospel of Luke that do not occur in Matthew or Mark or John. I have a special interest in Luke, and I want to remind you just a couple of pieces of Luke's story that I think are relevant to where we're going tonight. Early church tradition says that Luke was born and raised in Antioch, Syria. You may recognize that as sort of the starting point of Paul's various missionary journeys. But Antioch was the third largest city in the Roman Empire. It was a cosmopolitan city. That meant there were people from all over the place. You would find Egyptians there, and Romans, and Greeks, and a lot of Jews. Pretty strong Jewish community in Antioch, Syria as well. So if Luke was born there, he was probably born into a family of privilege. We know that because he's so articulate, both in regular everyday Greek and in formal literary Greek. And so he probably went to school. He got a good Hellenistic education, which meant that a very, very diverse and broad education. And then at some point, he developed an interest in medicine. And in those days, that didn't necessarily mean that it was a place of status or recognition or respect. So doctors were kind of looked at with maybe mixed ideas by the population. There were so many quacks out there doing weird things. Just because you're a doctor doesn't mean everybody thinks a lot of you. And my guess is that Luke's daddy, who was probably a wealthy, influential person, might have been disappointed that his son decided to be a doctor. And if you're going to start as a doctor, you're going to attach yourself to some kind of mentor. You're going to be an apprentice for a while, and you're probably going to start in the agora, which is the public marketplace. So imagine yourself going to some, public mall or whatever. You set up a little booth, and if you want to get medical treatment here, well, we can do certain things for you. We can certainly put a Band-Aid on if you want it. We can check your pulse. We can look at your eyes, whatever the doctors would do. And then you have to work your way up the ladder. And you do have certain medical treatments that are recognized and others that maybe are questionable. But eventually, Luke probably attached himself to the Roman officers who were in the area. So this is a cosmopolitan area, but the Romans are very much in charge. And wherever the Romans are very much in charge, they're going to make sure they're in charge with a legion of soldiers who are keeping order in the day and, if necessary, in the night. And this is totally Bob. It may be way off, but my guess is that this is where he may have met a Roman officer by the name of Theophilus, whose name means lover of God. And you think, that's cool, he loves God. There were lots of gods in the Roman Empire. It doesn't necessarily mean that was his name, that he loved the God of the Bible, but he was a religious person. And whether at that point or maybe later on he changed his name to Theophilus, Luke somehow attached himself to him. And Philippi, when the Apostle Paul eventually met Luke, was actually a place where retired Roman officers would go to live. So think Brunswick Forest in the first century. This is where retired people go. And they buy their homes and they hang out. And it's a community of retired Roman officers and leaders. So when they get there, Luke is attached to Theophilus. He's his patron. But then the Apostle Paul comes through, and that's where apparently Luke actually meets Jesus. He meets Jesus through the work of the Apostle Paul, and Theophilus probably also became a Christian through the influence of the Apostle Paul. So now we have Luke in Philippi, and that's where he begins to travel with Paul and becomes very influential. So what I want you to remember about Luke is that he's a physician, that he's an itinerant, that he's probably attached to a Roman officer of some kind, and that's who he writes the Gospel of Luke in the book of Acts 4. So with that in mind, I'm always curious, no matter what passage we get to, why did Luke include this in his Gospel? Because he could have included lots of different stories, and he included some that nobody else included. So I'm particularly curious about certain passages that are only in Luke. Did it have something to do with Luke's story? Well, let's see if that works out when we look at this story that we studied last week. So I'm going to read it again, and this time I have words in red that I just want you to highlight that I think are the focus, because Luke chapter 16 is known as the most puzzling parable, the most difficult parable, the most confusing parable of all the ones Jesus told, right? I don't think it's really that difficult to deal with once you understand it better. So watch for the words in red. because this connects the parable itself and the way Jesus interprets and applies the parable. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and he asked him, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer." The manager said to himself, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses." So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, "How much do you owe my master?" 900 gallons of olive oil, he replied. That's roughly equivalent to 16 55-gallon barrels of olive oil. That's a lot, right? It would fry a lot of your food for a long time to come. The manager told him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 450. I'm going to half it for you." Then he asked the second, "How much do you owe?" 1,000 bushels of wheat. That's about 30 tons and roughly equivalent to a tractor trailer load of wheat. So again, we're talking about a large quantity. And he says, "Okay, sit down, make your bill, 800, and we'll call it even." The master then does, and this is where the surprise in the story comes, the master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? And if you've not been trustworthy, some versions say faithful, with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one, despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. So you see how all this comes back to where he started. The man is a manager, but he's a servant manager. He's responsible for someone else's stuff. And as you look over not only the story itself, but the application of the story, it's all about being a good manager. That's the theme of what's going on in Luke chapter 16. Let's not lose that. And when people discuss this parable, they wrestle with two different issues. I've called it a parable a couple of times, but some people say it might not be a parable. Evidence that it's a parable, well, the parable was usually spoken to disciples, and we're told he said this to the disciples. Second, the way it starts is kind of the way Jesus often starts a parable. He has a random person. There was a rich man in this case. There's a twist often in the parables. So like the Good Samaritan, where the twist is, wow, a good Samaritan? Now we have a twist. Oh, a dishonest manager who is commended. So there's a twist in the story. That sounds kind of parabolic. And then it's part of a parable cluster. So all of Luke chapter 15 are the parables of the lost sheep and the lost coin and the lost son. Those are called parables. And then we have this story, and then we have one more that we'll get to later tonight from later in chapter 16. So maybe this is a whole cluster of parables, in which case it's a parable. And the clear theme, however, is management. That's what's going on here. Parables usually have one main point. You can push that too far, but basically parables have one main point, which is why you get lost in parables. For example, the parable of the sower, if you try to make every part of the story mean something, there's a main point there, which has to do with sowing the word of God, right? So parables usually have one main point. This one has one main point. It's about being a good manager. But then others say, well, it could be a true story because the audience changes from chapter 15. Chapter 15 was the audience of the tax collectors and the sinners, and now we have the disciples. So there is a shift in audience. If chapter 15 is about parables, now we have maybe a different group of people. Also, this is not called a parable. Luke 10 times in telling the stories that Jesus says, he uses the word parable, parabole in Greek. So 10 times he says, this is a parable that Jesus told. He doesn't use that of this one. Maybe this is a true story. There's some realistic detail here. There's a manager. There are bill quantities that are very specific. And Luke often intersperses true stories and parables. The main reason people say this might not be a parable is it's not like Jesus at all to pick a hero for a parable who's dishonest. So maybe this actually happened. This was a real story, and Jesus is using a sort of a case study in order to teach something about management. In any case, there are lots of different applications. Jesus doesn't just make one. There's a theme to it, but there are lots of different applications. So some people say, okay, maybe it's a true story. Then the second issue is debated more often, which is the manager a good guy or a bad guy? We talked about this a little bit last week. So those who say the manager is a bad guy, well, right up front, he's accused of wasting the owner's possessions. So it doesn't matter. You don't even have to get past verse 1. You're already thinking bad guy, right? Second, he's fired on the spot. He's dismissed from his job. Why would the manager do that? Maybe there was, prior evidence that the guy was a little questionable. They also use the word ashamed. So that's a negative description of him. And then he's very self-willed. He goes, I know what I'm going to do. And when he does it, it seems kind of devious. He's going to ask forgiveness, not permission, which people who are managees love to do. Managers don't like it. We prefer that you ask permission in advance. This guy's going to do what he has and then ask forgiveness. But he's a bad guy because he's actually described with a word in Greek that means not righteous. The at the front of the word is a negative word. So dikia is righteous. He's not righteous. He's unrighteous. He's dishonest in some translations. But then others say, well, maybe he's not a bad guy after all. Maybe he's a good guy. After all, he's accused of wasting possessions, but there's no proof of that. We don't know that. We just say he was accused. The manager says, all right, I'm going to give you time. You can give an account. So the manager fires him on the spot, but he doesn't, say, turn in your keys and get off the property. Like, I want you to give me an account of what's been going on. Gives him a little benefit of the doubt. And then those bill reductions, they could have been dishonest, but as we said last week, they could have been the manager deducting his own commission. So he could have said, like, I'm just going to take off my cut that I would have had. Or it could have been that the owner was actually charging usury, which is exorbitant interest that Jews weren't allowed to charge other Jews, and therefore the manager was actually taking off the usury. And then he is commended by the owner. So once he does this, the owner's not mad about that. He's saying, great job. You did something really shrewd or wise. And the word dishonest, even though its form is literally not righteous, it's also used in a couple more verses in this same passage just to mean worldly. In other words, it's not a godly thing. It's a thing of this world. So maybe he's not dishonest. Maybe he's just calling him a worldly manager, somebody who operates in the things of this world. So that's the debate. And the word shrewd that comes up means wise and sensible. So this is the argument that maybe Jesus is actually using a crook as a hero for one of his stories. Maybe he's actually a good guy. So, but the question then comes back to, how does Jesus apply this parable? Well, if the manager is a bad guy, Jesus' application is, be wise with your generation, make eternal friends with your wealth. This is all in our passage. Be trustworthy, not dishonest, whether you have a little bit or much. Be trustworthy in managing other stuff. And you can't serve God in money, right? Those are Jesus's applications if the guy is a bad guy. The key point is, manage well what God gives you. If the manager is a good guy, the applications are, be shrewd, make eternal friends, be trustworthy in managing other stuff. You can't serve God. Does the list look familiar? My point is, sometimes we waste all of our energy and time debating something when the point of the story is exactly the same. So I've seen so much paper and time wasted on debating the point about whether the guy was a good guy or a bad guy, and forgetting the bottom line is it's really about managing well what God gives you. And same thing with a parable. If it's a parable, it has one main point, manage well what God gives you, all the other subpoints. If it's a true story, manage well what God gives you and all the other subpoints. So I think we have to focus on the things that are most important, and it's not helpful when Christians get into these sometimes severe debates about interpretation and miss the greater point that Jesus is actually making in the story. So that's where I want to spend just a couple of minutes. Focus on this. So this is the key verse. The people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. That's what connects the story to the application, this idea of being shrewd. Jesus wants us to be shrewd. So the people of this world are shrewd. They know how to serve the system. They know how to make a buck. They know how to not sweat the small stuff so they can go for the bottom line profit margin. They know how to recognize risks. They know how to seize the moment. They know how to climb the ladder. They know how to survive another day. This is all part of the world system. Am I right? Yeah. That's how the world operates. And that's exactly what the manager did, right? He knew how to make the system work for him. So the people of this world are shrewd in worldly things. And what Jesus is saying is that people of the light need to have a totally different system. We have to reorient our thinking from the ways of the world, which is all about making a buck and surviving another day and seizing the moment, to learning a whole new system of values. And this system of values is about relationships. It's about the relationship with God. It's about the relationship with people and bringing people into God's eternal dwelling. So think eternal instead of just in the moment. Sweat the small stuff, Jesus says. The little things matter. And if you're not faithful in the small stuff, nobody's going to entrust you with the big stuff. And the small stuff, Jesus seems to be implying, is the worldly wealth. It's the dollars and cents. The big stuff is what happens in eternity. The big stuff is your character and your integrity. So prioritize faithfulness, whether it's in a little or a lot, whether it's your stuff or someone else's stuff. Prioritize being a faithful and trustworthy person. So remember that you're free to make a choice, and the choice I want you to make, Jesus says, is to choose your master, because you can't choose both God and money. You're going to have to decide, is my God, is my idol what I can make, what I can accumulate, what I can do, what stature I can get, or is my God truly God? The essence of an idol is something that replaces God or substitutes for God, or something that we trust instead of God. And Jesus is saying, does that apply to your money, or does that apply to your God? So be shrewd in godly things, be wise in godly things. This is the shift that Jesus is giving us from this story. So don't get too lost in the little details, get lost in the main point and ask yourself, how is my level of shrewdness? So this is where I connect this back to Luke being the one who tells the story and nobody else does. My theory is that Matthew and Mark and John had probably all heard it. Matthew and John in person, and Mark maybe through Peter. But for whatever reason, maybe because it was an odd story for Jesus to tell and they didn't want to confuse people, they left it out. Luke goes, this is a great story. It needs to be included. And why would Luke do that? Well, for one thing, Luke is one of the people who has moved from the system of the world to the system of light. He was raised in the Greco-Roman system of morality, that worldly system, whereas the other disciples were kind of raised in a Jewish environment around the law. And yes, it took them a while to figure out who Jesus was. But Luke says, this is my story. I was in the world system and I got brought into the system of light. And so his uniquely Luke story also allowed him to take all the gifts that he had had, all the experience he had had, and allow him to serve God with it. He knew what it meant to start small and be faithful in small things. Somebody needs a Band-Aid. I can do that. And by the time he's done, Theophilus is saying, I need eye surgery. Can you do that? If you're not faithful in small things, you're not going to be trusted in big things. And that's Luke's story. I started in the marketplace with very simple medical stuff. And then I got tasked not only to Theophilus, but eventually to the Apostle Paul, who went to all those places to spread the word of God. And God trusted me to keep Paul healthy. So start faithful in the small things, and then you'll be given larger responsibilities. And Jesus' dishonest steward connected the two worlds, the world that Luke had grown up in and the world in which he had, his whole frame of mind had been reframed. And Luke also knew, because he's the only Gentile writer of a book of the Bible, Luke's thinking the Gentiles are going to need this story because the Gentiles thoroughly know what it means to be surrounded by the system of this world, whether you live in America or China or Africa. Luke's going like, when Gentiles hear the gospel, they need to know this contrast between the old world, the world system, and God's system. So I think that's why Luke includes this marvelous story. And what I have to be asking is, what is the part of my story that is uniquely me? Because every one of us has parts of our story that God has brought us through, and maybe some parts of the story we were not believers. Maybe we've been in church all of our lives and been faithful Christians all of our lives. But there are bumps in everybody's story too, and things that we never thought would turn out that way. And my responsibility is to say, like Luke did, what is all the stuff that God has done in my life? And how can I take all of that stuff and use it in this moment for God? Most of us here, not all, are retired, and maybe there are others who are working as well. But I don't know about the other retirees in the room, but my this isn't going to sound right. My status has been somewhat downgraded in retirement. I used to pastor a church of 2,000 people and had a staff of 35 people, and it wasn't the biggest church in the world, but had a lot of influence and authority. And when I preached, there were not thousands, but hundreds of people who were listening. And so Linda and I took a sabbatical. But then part of what we're doing here with these Bible studies is we're saying, I don't think God wants us to waste the experiences that we have. So what is it in this season of life that we can continue to do? And I would challenge all of you with that. What money do you have? What time do you have? What resources do you have? What gifts do you have? What experiences do you have? Be faithful even when you start small and get bigger, or maybe when you're big and you're at the top and then you get smaller again. It's still the matter of being faithful with whatever God does. Why? Because eternity matters. And how we live our lives and how we influence people and how we use our resources for eternity is what matters most to Luke. There's a great song that came to mind several times this week for me. And if you've been into contemporary Christian music for 50 years, you might recognize it or remember it. It's by a guy named Ray Boltz from 1988. And this is the theme of the song. So in the song, he says, I dreamed I went to heaven, and there were all these people who started coming up and saying, do you realize the impact you had on my life? So one by one, they came far as the eye could see, each life somehow touched by your generosity. Little things that you had done, sacrifices made, unnoticed on the earth, and heaven now proclaimed. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I am a life that was changed. Thank you for giving to the Lord. I'm so glad you gave. And he tells these stories about, giving to a missionary, he went on a mission trip, or teaching Sunday school or whatever. Like, what did you do that you didn't think it had any impact and eternity? This is, I think, Jesus's point when he says, use your resources wisely to make friends so that they'll be able to welcome you into eternal dwellings. I have a feeling that was the inspiration for Ray Boltz's song. Like, people are going to be in heaven or look back and say, I was at a pivot point in my life, and because of what you did with what God gave you, my life was totally changed. I think that's the point of Luke chapter 16. Don't argue about the good guy, bad guy. Just get the bottom line point. Amen? All right. So